The Dowager of Stanthorpe threw a full glass of red wine across the front of Miss Linwood's dress in front of 20 dinner guests and called it an accident. She did not even look down at the spreading red stain before she turned back to the table, lifting a clean napkin with the composed expression of a woman who had simply encountered a minor inconvenience. "Do go and change," she said. "There is really no need for you to remain." The dining room at Stanthorpe Hall went very quiet. Miss Mary Linwood stood at the edge of the table in what had once been a good dress, cream silk, sent from London 2 days ago in an unmarked box she had not opened until this evening, and did not move. She did not raise her voice. She did not look down at the wine dripping from her bodice to the parquet floor. She looked instead at the far wall, where a portrait of the Duke of Stanthorpe hung beside the fireplace, and she was very still. He was watching her from across the room, not the portrait, the man himself. He had returned to Stanthorpe Hall the previous day after 3 months of diplomatic business on the continent, and he had not yet spoken more than 12 words to her directly. He sat at the head of the table where he had always sat, formally dressed in the correct way of a man for whom ceremony is not performance but discipline, with the particular stillness of someone who has learned over a long time not to show anything that could be used against him. He was watching her with an expression she had not seen on his face since Vienna. Then he set down his wine glass. Mary Linwood was the Duchess of Stanthorpe. She had been the Duchess of Stanthorpe since November the 12th of the previous year, when she and Charles Aubrey Carew, the Duke of Stanthorpe, had stood before a civil registrar on the Graben in Vienna and signed their names to a document that was currently sitting in his diplomatic case on the sideboard. His mother did not know this. His mother had spent 3 months calling her the impertinent governess, docking her wages by whatever fraction of a pretext was available, locking the household food cupboard on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and on 2 separate occasions slapping her hand at the dinner table for the presumption of reaching toward the bread basket before she had been invited to do so. His mother had done all of this in front of the children, in front of the servants, in front of anyone who happened to be present, and had done it with the serenity of a woman who believed entirely and completely in her own authority. His mother had just thrown red wine on her dress in front of 20 witnesses. Mary Linwood stood in the silence of Stanthorpe Hall's dining room and waited. She had arrived at the hall in November with a single trunk, a letter from the Duke's London solicitor engaging her services as governess to his 3 orphaned nieces and nephews, and the marriage certificate folded into the lining of her travelling case. She had been a vicar's daughter from Shropshire, which meant she had grown up poor and careful and saturated in words in several languages. Her father had believed that a girl who knew Latin and French and possessed a tolerance for discomfort could survive most of what the world had available to offer her. He had not been wrong about the discomfort. Her father had died when she was 19. There was no money and no property, and a distant cousin who made it plain that he did not consider the vicarage a home for unmarried daughters of any age. She had taken the only position available as companion to an English widow named Mrs. Helena Voss, who was wintering on the continent for her health and required someone who could read aloud in French and manage the practical difficulties of foreign travel. Mrs. Voss had died in March in Vienna, and then Mary had been stranded, no funds, no passage, no employer, in a city where she knew no one except the staff of the English diplomatic delegation, who were kind in the way that occupied people are kind when they want a problem to become someone else's responsibility as quickly as possible. She had met the Duke there. That was all she allowed herself to think of it during the 3 months before he came back. She had met him. He had arranged her situation. Then the certificate, his departure, his instruction, and Stanthorpe Hall. What she had not anticipated was the Dowager. Lady Eleanor Carew, formerly Lady Eleanor Cavendish, still possessed of every social instinct she had accumulated over 60 years in the first rank of English society, had looked at Mary on the day of her arrival and made a decision that was visible in her face before a single word passed between them. The decision was, "This girl is a servant, and I will treat her accordingly until she behaves like one." By the end of the first week, Mary understood that the Dowager had received no information about a marriage. The Duke's letter had said only, "Engage Miss Linwood as governess until I return." By the end of the first month, she understood that the Dowager did not think of governesses as people in the operative sense of the word. The food cupboard was locked on the days the Dowager inspected household accounts. Mary's wages were reduced whenever the Dowager found a pretext, a lesson she considered too ambitious for children under 10. The crime of being in the morning room before the Dowager had finished her correspondence, a smudge on the schoolroom window that Mary had not yet identified the origin of. On those 2 occasions the Dowager had corrected her hand at the dinner table with the light, definite gesture of someone accustomed to correcting animals, and had returned to her own plate without comment. Mary had not said anything. She had folded her hand in her lap and looked at the far wall. There was a maid on the upper floor named Agnes, a compact and observant woman of about 30 who had been in service at Stanthorpe Hall for 11 years. Agnes had no patience for what was happening, and even less capacity for performing patience about it. On the days the food cupboard was locked, Agnes left a covered plate outside Mary's room with the punctuality of someone fulfilling a private obligation. They never discussed it directly, because there was no need to. What kept Mary at Stanthorpe Hall was the children. 3 of them, Thomas, aged 9, and the twin girls Catherine and Eleanor, aged 7, who were the children of the Duke's late sister and her late husband, and who had arrived at the Hall 2 years earlier with the quiet flatness of children who have learned that needing things produces disappointment. They were not difficult. They had simply decided, somewhere in their grief, to take up as little space as possible. In the first week of December, Mary had been reading with Thomas after the twins went to bed. He was working through a passage of French translation, and he had stopped in the middle of it, put the book face down on the table, and said in the flat voice of a boy reporting a fact he had come to accept, "My mother used to read to us at night. She was very good at the voices." Mary had not said anything immediately. She let the statement exist for a moment without fixing it or softening it, because Thomas was 9 years old and he had offered her something true, and he deserved to have it received truly. Then she said, "What was her best voice?" He thought about it. "The villain," he said. "She was frightening." He picked the book back up and returned to the passage without further comment. Mary had not pressed him. They finished the translation. She walked him to his room, said good night, and it had been nothing, except that after that evening he began arriving at lessons early. Eleanor and Catherine needed the same thing in a different form. They needed to be given tasks that assumed they were capable of performing them, to be addressed as people whose opinions were worth hearing. By January, the night waking had stopped entirely. The Dowager had noticed the change in the children and mentioned it to her guests several times as evidence of excellent household management. She had not mentioned Miss Linwood's name in this connection. Mary had let her. She had the marriage certificate and a growing knowledge of English matrimonial law and 3 months of patience that was becoming something harder and quieter than patience. She had also, in those 3 months, learned one thing about the Dowager Eleanor Linwood that she had not expected to learn. Agnes had told her in January, folding linen with the efficient movements of someone who has worked out what information is useful and what is not. The Dowager had loved her son's first wife, Anne, not the performance of approval, not the affection that comes with a useful alliance. Something more than that. Agnes had once watched them from the upper hall window, the Dowager and Anne standing together at the edge of the kitchen garden in a February rain, arguing over something to do with the tenant cottages, neither of them moving inside, and then both of them laughing at the same moment, turning toward the house together. Anne had sat with the Dowager over morning correspondence and walked the estate in the afternoons and argued with considerable spirit about things that mattered to her. When Anne died, the Duke had left for the continent and not come back for 2 years. "She is not cruel by nature," Agnes had said, without looking up from the linen. "She is cruel because she has decided what you are, and she has decided that partly because of what she lost. She will not be reasonable about it, but it is worth knowing the difference." Mary had found it worth knowing. She had not found it sufficient to forgive. The two things are not the same. What she had not known, until Agnes told her 4 days before the Duke's return, was that the Dowager had already written to the English diplomatic delegation in Vienna, more than a week past. Agnes told her in a whisper, outside the schoolroom door. The Dowager had overheard a phrase of German that Mary had given the children for their lesson, accurate, idiomatic, Vienna-specific, and had become curious, and had written. Agnes had seen the letter go out, and had been watching for the reply ever since. It was expected imminently. Mary had gone back into the schoolroom and been very still for a while. Then she had gone, late that evening, to the library, and taken down the volume on English matrimonial law that she had first consulted before she left Vienna, when the Duke had been explaining what the certificate meant and what obligations it carried. She read for 2 hours. She closed the book, replaced it precisely, and went to bed. She had read the statute before. She read it again because certainty is different from memory. She knew what the Dowager's letter could do and what it could not. She knew the specific cases, the specific holdings, the specific language of the Act. Her father had spent 30 years teaching her that knowledge is the only kind of property that cannot be locked in a cupboard, and she had believed him, and she was going to find out soon whether he had been right. The night before the Duke's return, she sat at her writing desk with the marriage certificate unfolded before her, and thought about Vienna. Not sentimentally, accurately. She had been stranded and practically without money in a foreign city, and the Duke had been the senior English diplomatic figure in residence with a standing obligation to English subjects in difficulty abroad. She had understood from the beginning that she was a problem to be solved, and she had not resented it because practical solutions are what they are regardless of the emotional temperature surrounding them. What had not been practical was the conversation. It had been an accident of scheduling. A late evening in early November, she in the delegation house sitting room with old French grammar from her employment with Mrs. Voss, he returning unexpectedly from a diplomatic engagement that had ended early. They had talked for 2 hours, and she would have said at first that they had talked about nothing, but she would have been wrong. They had talked about the 3 children at Stanthorpe Hall and the letters he received from them, and the particular quietness of a man who worries at a distance. They had talked about her father's parish in autumn, and what Shropshire smells like in October, which she could describe precisely, which seemed to matter to him. They had talked about Vienna and what it is to be perpetually in transit, always arriving somewhere that already expects you to leave. She had not known then about Anne. He had told her about Anne on the morning before the ceremony, only that he had been married before, that his wife had died, that she had died while he was away and he had not been there. He said it in the way people say things they have learned to carry without being asked to put them down, and she had not pressed for more, and he had not offered it. And the following morning they had gone to the registrar's office together. He had said, "I propose, if you are willing, to put your name on a document that makes you legally mine so that the next time I am 300 miles away, you are not dependent on the goodwill of strangers." She had said, "That is the least romantic proposal I have ever heard." He had said, "I know, I apologize. I am entirely out of practice." She had said yes. She refolded the certificate now, returned it to the travelling case, and went to the window. Somewhere down the drive in the morning a carriage would arrive. She had been rehearsing this moment for 3 months, and she was still not entirely certain what it would contain. The only thing she was sure of was that she had not come this far to leave. The Duke of Stanthorpe arrived at 2:30 on a Wednesday afternoon in February, and the effect of his arrival preceded him by approximately 15 minutes. Agnes came to the schoolroom a quarter of an hour before the carriage appeared at the gate, delivering the information with the neutral expression of someone who has appointed herself an intelligence service and takes the role seriously. "He's on the drive," Agnes said, and added nothing further. Mary dismissed the children early on the pretext of a merit break. Thomas accepted this with transparent relief. The twins accepted it with the suspicion of children who know a pretext when they hear one, but find the outcome satisfactory regardless. Then she went to the window. The household assembled itself with the efficiency of a body that has been waiting. Mrs. Pemberton, the housekeeper, appeared at the front entrance with the posture of someone performing their function before an audience that matters. The 2 footmen who ordinarily occupied the rear of the house materialized at the front without instruction. The Dowager emerged in a gown she had not been wearing at luncheon and stood on the steps with her chin at the angle that meant she expected to be confirmed in something. The carriage came through the gate. Mary watched the Duke step down from it. She had not seen him in 3 months, and had been careful not to indulge the habit of reconstructing his face from memory, which was the most available defence against becoming dependent on someone who had not yet honoured what he had promised. She had been moderately successful at this. Not entirely. He was taller than she remembered, or the steps were lower, or 3 months of a cold house had compressed her sense of what a man who takes up his actual space in the world looks like. He moved with the economy of someone who has spent 20 years never quite arriving anywhere. Always between the last place and the next, always with the following arrangement already underway. He embraced his mother briefly with the reserve of a man for whom affection is something kept for private. He shook Mrs. Pemberton's hand, which was not the gesture of a man who categorizes by rank, and Mrs. Pemberton's posture changed in a small and visible way when he did it. Then he turned and looked directly at the upstairs window. Mary stepped back from it. He had seen her. He had been looking for that window before the carriage came fully to a stop, which was not something he had examined closely during the journey from London, but which he could not pretend, standing in the February drive with his mother's hand on his arm, was anything other than what it was. 3 months was a long time to tell himself the arrangement was temporary. She found out an hour later whether he had seen her. She had brought the children to the afternoon drawing-room visit, a daily fixture the Dowager used to demonstrate the household's adequate management of its charges, which was to say the children were walked in, displayed, and walked out, without any particular conversation being required of them. And the Duke was there. He was standing by the fireplace with his hands behind his back and the formal distance he wore like a second set of clothes. When Mary came through the door with the 3 children preceding her, he did not move toward them. He looked at them and then past them at Mary, and then back at them, with the attention of a man who has been receiving letters about children for 3 months and is now seeing what letters cannot convey. He said, "Miss Linwood, I trust the children have prospered." 12 words, not 12 of the ones that mattered. "They have, Your Grace," she said. "Thomas is reading 2 years ahead of his age. The girls have made considerable progress in French." She paused. "They are well." The Dowager said, "Miss Linwood manages them adequately." The word adequately carried 7 distinct layers of dismissal. The Duke said nothing to this. He looked at Thomas and said, "Show me what you have been reading." Thomas fetched the volume from his jacket pocket. He had learned to keep it there, because lessons could happen anywhere Mary was, and explained where they were in it and what the passage meant. He did not perform the explanation. He gave it directly, with the clean confidence of a child who has been consistently treated as someone whose understanding matters. Mary watched the Duke's face during this. She watched him listen to his nephew with the unhurried attention of someone who had been receiving correspondence about these children for 3 months and was now understanding what the correspondence had not been able to contain. The shift in his expression was not large. It was the specific adjustment of a man encountering something better than what he had prepared himself to find. And it lasted for exactly as long as Thomas was speaking, and then he composed himself and thanked the boy. Agnes was at the far end of the room collecting the tea tray, and she watched the Duke's face for the entire duration of Thomas's explanation. When she passed Mary on the way out, she caught her eye for 1 precise second without slowing. Neither of them said anything. Neither needed to. He came to the schoolroom that evening, after the children had been sent for supper, and the house had settled into the quiet hour between activities when the Dowager was at her correspondence, and the schoolroom existed for a time as if it were its own country. Mary was at her desk writing the following day's lesson when she heard the door and turned to find him in the frame of it. He stood there for a moment without speaking, looking at the room, the globe at the window where Mary had pushed it, so the afternoon light fell across the Atlantic, the twins' drawings pinned to the board, Thomas's books stacked by frequency of use. "You kept the globe," he said. "I use it for the lessons," she said. "The twins respond to geography they can turn in their hands." "It was my sister's. She gave it to me before my first diplomatic posting." A pause, and something in his expression shifted slightly, in the way of a man who has just said something without intending to say it. "I left it here when I went because I had not decided whether I was coming back to this house." Mary looked at him. "The children have learned where everything is," she said. "I would not move it now." He crossed the room and sat in the chair across from her desk, the chair Thomas used, and looked at her with the directness he had used in Vienna, without the formal distance he had worn all afternoon. "Has she hurt you?" he said. 3 words, and they carried the weight of 3 months of letters he had written and received and answered, with the steady register of a man who had told himself the arrangement was temporary and therefore manageable. "I am quite well, Your Grace," she said, because the composure was not performance by this point. It had become the truest version of herself available at that hour, the self that had survived 3 months of being treated as nothing. Then, because he was here and had asked and she was tired of formulas, she has been thorough. A muscle in his jaw moved. He looked at the globe, then back. I believed, he said, that if you arrived quietly, already established, already a fact the household had to accommodate, she would have no public event to build from, that the arrangement would simply have to be accepted over time. I wrote a letter twice during those 3 months. Both times I put it aside. A letter, read in her own sitting room with no one present, gives her months to act before I return. I needed to be here when she was told. He stopped. I was wrong about what she was capable of directing at a person she believed to be without recourse. I owe you the full explanation. But not tonight, with 20 guests at dinner tomorrow evening. You owe me more than an explanation, Mary said. Yes, he said. He held her gaze. I know that. Tomorrow. She looked at him for a moment. She had spent 3 months trusting the certificate in her travelling case because she had no other options. She could trust him for 1 more day. Tomorrow, she said. He stood, looked once more at the globe on the windowsill, and left. That evening, when she went to retrieve the candle she had stored in the food cupboard on Tuesday, she found the cupboard unlocked. She stood at it for a moment, her hand on the door, and then took the candle and went back to her room. The box was on the bed, marked with a London dressmaker's name she recognised. A good house, not extravagant but not cheap. And when she lifted the tissue, she found cream silk inside, the same shade she had worn in Vienna, cut to a size that, when she finally put it on that evening, fit well enough for a man who had described what he remembered and trusted the dressmaker to interpret it. He had known the colour. He had remembered it. He had arranged this before he boarded his carriage in London, before he passed through the gate that afternoon, before he spoke those 12 formal words to her in the drawing-room. He had arranged it before any of that, which meant she had been in his thoughts at a distance in a way she had spent 3 months refusing to let herself count on. She sat down on the edge of the bed with the dress across her lap and did not move for a while. The room was cold. Outside, the house had gone quiet in the way it went quiet after 9 when the Dowager retired and took her authority with her. Mary sat in the dark with the silk in her hands and thought about 3 months of locked cupboards and docked wages and covered plates left silently outside her door, and about the certificate in her travelling case that had been her only company since November, and about a man who had looked directly at the upstairs window the moment his carriage came through the gate. For the first time in 3 months, she wept, not noisily, quietly, with her hands pressed over her face in the dark, because the recognition was almost unbearable, that she had not been forgotten, that the waiting had not been nothing, that the certificate had never been only paper, and she had known that and told herself every day that knowing was enough, and now something had confirmed it, and she was not, it turned out, as unaffected by the confirmation as she had believed. After a while she stopped. She washed her face, lit the candle, and got out the legal volume from the shelf above the washstand. She read for another hour. She was not going to be undone by a box from a dressmaker. She was going to be ready. The morning of the dinner, Agnes came to her room before the household had finished waking. She had been expecting something. The Dowager's letter to Vienna had left 10 days before the Duke arrived. A reply, if it came, would arrive in the standard post. The morning of a major dinner, 20 guests, the welcome home, the perfect public stage, was exactly the right moment for a woman who needed her weapons available when the audience was largest. Agnes stood in the doorway with the expression she reserved for information collected at some personal cost and said, "She had a letter this morning, from Vienna, before breakfast. I did not see the contents." "Did she seem pleased with it?" "She seemed," Agnes said, "like someone who had been handed something she intended to use tonight." Mary thanked her, and Agnes withdrew. Mary sat with the marriage certificate in her hands and thought through what the letter could and could not contain. It could confirm the registration entry, which was public record. It could name the parties and the date. It could give the Dowager everything she needed to build a challenge. She would not need the challenge to be sound. She would only need it to be loud, at the right moment, in front of the right audience. Mary put on her day dress and went downstairs and knocked on the door of the Duke's study. He was at his desk. He looked up. She placed the marriage certificate on the desk between them. She said, "She has had a letter from Vienna. She knows the marriage is registered. She will make her move tonight in front of your guests, because that is her method, and that is the kind of weapon that requires an audience to do its work." He looked at the certificate. He looked at her. "What do you want to do?" She had not expected the question framed that way. She had expected him to tell her what he intended. "I want to know whether you intend to honour this before I decide how much of my own position I am prepared to risk," she said. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I owe you something before tonight." He paused. "Sit down." She sat. He looked at the certificate on the desk between them, and then up at her. "Her name was Anne," he said. "Anne Charlotte Gresham before she married me. She was 20 years old in February of 1811, when I went to Lisbon on the King's business." He said it in the way someone says a thing they have rehearsed until the rehearsal has replaced the feeling. But the feeling was still there underneath it, visible if you knew where to look. "She died in childbirth while I was there. Her letter reached me 3 days after it was over. She had known, near the end, that something was wrong, and she had written to tell me. The letter took 3 days longer than it should have, and by the time I returned, she had been buried for a week, the child with her." Mary said nothing. There was nothing to say that would be equal to it, and she had learned that trying to find something equal is usually worse than silence. "I had been," he said, "the kind of husband who believed that rank and duty were sufficient to excuse absence, that providing a house and a staff and a sufficient income was a kind of presence. I discovered, when her letter reached me in Lisbon, that it was not." He paused. "I have not been unaware of this since." Mary watched his face. The formal distance was gone. What she was seeing now was not the performance of courtesy he wore everywhere else. It was the expression of a man who has been carrying something for 15 years without finding anywhere to put it down, and who was, perhaps, in the process of finding a place. "I married you quietly in Vienna," he said, "because I could not again be the man whose position became the mechanism that destroyed his wife. I thought if there was no public event, no announcement, no formal presentation, no spectacle my mother could mobilize against, she would simply have to accommodate the fact of you, that by the time I returned you would already be known and established, and there would be nothing to attack." He met her eyes. "I was wrong about what she was capable of directing at a person she believed to be entirely without recourse," Mary said. "You were wrong about several things." "Yes," he said. He did not look away. "I was wrong to leave you here without the whole of it. I was wrong to believe that protecting you from spectacle was the same as protecting you." A pause. "I need you to know that I was not wrong that I married you. I was not wrong about that." She looked at him for a moment. The morning light was on the floor between them, and outside she could hear the children in the courtyard below, Thomas's voice carrying above the twins in the way it did when he was winning an argument about something that did not ultimately matter. "I know," she said. "I knew it in November." He exhaled, a small, controlled sound that cost him something. She said, "I have read the statute. The continental civil ceremony is recognized under English matrimonial law. Your mother's letter does not change that. She may challenge it publicly. She will not succeed legally. The act is clear, and there are 2 supporting decisions in the case law." He looked at her with a different attention. "How long have you known that?" "Since October," she said, "before I left Vienna. I read the statute the day after you explained what the certificate was. I have read it 4 times since." Something shifted in his face. It was the same adjustment she had seen when Thomas spoke, the recalibration of someone encountering something better than their expectation. He said, "I would have given you more time to prepare if I had known she would move this quickly." "You gave me 3 months," Mary said. "I used them." He picked up the certificate and placed it in the diplomatic case on the stand beside the desk. He closed the case. "Why not this morning?" Mary said. "Before the guests arrive." He looked at her. "Because a private confrontation gives her the afternoon to begin managing the response. 20 witnesses remove that option." He paused. "She chose a public stage for every humiliation she delivered in this house. I intend to use the same stage." Mary said nothing for a moment. Then, "Tonight." "Tonight," he said, and the word had the weight of a decided thing. She stood. "I assumed," she said, and went back upstairs to dress. The dinner began at 7. 20 guests. The Lord Lieutenant and his wife, members of Parliament, a general and his sister, county families of the first rank, and Lady Cecilia Morrow and her mother, seated at the Dowager's right hand in the position that communicated intent without requiring a word. The candlelight was perfect. The Dowager herself was magnificent in a deep blue gown, made for an occasion she had been planning for some time. Mary was at the far end of the table in the position she had occupied for 3 months, present because the children required supervision at the early portion of the meal, below the salt, visible enough to be used and invisible enough to be used against. The Duke sat at the head of the table with his diplomatic case on the sideboard at his right elbow. For the first 2 courses the Dowager was at her absolute best, gracious, composed, directing the conversation with the expertise of a woman who has been conducting these performances for 40 years. She managed the table with the light, efficient authority of someone entirely at home in her own dominion. Midway through the 3rd course, she turned to the table with the air of someone who has just thought of something pleasant. "I have been telling our guests about the interesting circumstances that bring Miss Linwood to us," she said. "She joins us from Vienna, I understand. A diplomatic posting?" Every head turned toward Mary with the reflexive obedience of guests who take their direction from the host. "I was companion to Mrs. Helena Voss," Mary said. "She died in March. I came to Stanthorpe at His Grace's recommendation." Neutral. True. No more than the question required. "At His Grace's recommendation," the Dowager repeated. She let the pause sit for a moment, and then smiled at the table with the warmth of someone sharing a pleasant observation. "My son was always generous with his recommendations, to ladies of various circumstances, particularly when he was abroad, away from the usual accountabilities." The implication moved through the room like cold air under a door. Lady Cecilia Morrow looked at her plate. The Lord Lieutenant's wife looked at the Lord Lieutenant. Mary kept her eyes on the far wall and her hands still in her lap, and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that would not be used, and because composure was the only armour that had kept her intact for 3 months, and she was not going to remove it now. The Dowager reached for her wineglass. It was not an accident. The particular angle of the wrist, the deliberate pause before the movement, it had the appearance of an accident down to the last detail. It had none of the substance. The full glass went across Mary's shoulder and down the front of the cream silk dress in a single broad sweep. The dining room went completely silent. Mary looked down at the red wine spreading across the bodice. She looked up at the far wall. She was absolutely still. "Oh, how clumsy of me," the Dowager said, reaching for a clean napkin with the composure of a woman for whom this was a minor inconvenience. "Do go and change, Miss Linwood. There is really no need for you to remain." She turned back to the table as if the matter was concluded. Nobody spoke. Agnes stood at the sideboard with a serving cloth in her hands, her eyes fixed on the Duke. The Duke set down his wineglass. The sound was small and entirely audible in the silence. He said, "You will remain, Miss Linwood." He stood. The room had already been silent. It became something beyond silence. 20 people understanding simultaneously that what they were witnessing was not going to resolve into a minor family difficulty. He crossed to the sideboard, opened his diplomatic case, and drew out the folded document. He brought it to the head of the table without hurry and spread it in the candlelight, and then he read it aloud. He read it first in German because that was the language in which it was written, and he did not stumble. The name of the officiating registrar, the date, November the 12th, the location, the 2 witnesses. Then he read it again in English, sentence by sentence, until every person at the table had heard every word in a language they could not claim afterward to have misunderstood. He read Mary's name. He read his own. He set the certificate in the centre of the table in the candlelight. "Miss Linwood," he said, to the table, to the 20 faces turned toward him, "has been the Duchess of Stanthorpe since November the 12th. She has been resident in this house for 3 months at my explicit instruction, in the position of governess, pending my return from the continent. During those 3 months she has been subjected to systematic cruelty under the direction of this household. That ends tonight." A sound moved through the room, not a word, not quite a breath, but 20 people exhaling at the same moment. The Dowager said, "This is absurd. A foreign civil document from a city that is valid under English matrimonial law," Mary said, not loudly, with perfect clarity. Every head turned toward her. She stood at her end of the table in the ruined dress and did not raise her voice. She said, "The continental civil ceremony is recognized under the Act of 1753 and confirmed in the decisions of Wilson versus Wilson in 1781 and Hargreaves versus the Crown in 1804, both of which address specifically the validity of English parties to foreign civil ceremonies conducted before a licensed civil registrar. The document on that table satisfies every requirement of both decisions." She paused. "My father was a vicar with an extensive library and a belief that his daughter should understand the law that governed her life. I have read the relevant statute 4 times. I am prepared to read it a 5th time in front of anyone who requires it." The room was very still. The Dowager looked at her son. Something had happened to her expression. The social performance had cracked along a fault line that had always been there, and what was visible beneath it was not lesser, but plainer. "She is a charity case," she said, "a companion to a dead woman. Whatever she told you in Vienna, whatever she persuaded you to—" "She told me nothing," the Duke said. "I asked her to marry me. She accepted. The document is registered. My solicitor in London confirmed its standing before I left Vienna, and I have his written opinion in this case." He looked at his mother for a long moment. "Your Grace, you have spent 3 months humiliating my wife in my house. You locked her food cupboard. You docked her wages. You struck her hand at this table. You have told your guests that she is my former mistress in everything but explicit word." He did not raise his voice. He did not change his register. "I will not explain at length why this requires addressing." The Lord Lieutenant's wife was watching Mary with the expression of a woman recalculating every assumption she had brought to the evening. Lady Cecilia Morrow's mother set her napkin beside her plate. She did not stand yet. The gesture was enough. Lady Cecilia herself kept her eyes down and said nothing, and did not look at her mother. The Dowager rose. Her chair scraped back. She placed one hand on the table and looked at her son with the full accumulated force of 40 years of managing this house and every person in it. "You have married a nobody," she said, "a girl without family, without position, without a single claim to any of this. Your father would—" "My father," the Duke said, "is dead. His opinion is not available." "Then you will be moved to the Dower House by tomorrow morning. Mr. Pemberton will assist you with the arrangements." He turned to the steward at the room's edge. "Mr. Pemberton." "Your Grace," Mr. Pemberton said, with a formality that contained everything it needed to contain. "Your allowance will be reviewed by my solicitor next week," the Duke continued. "The household keys and accounts will be transferred to the Duchess tomorrow morning." The word entered the room. The Duchess. Mrs. Pemberton took one deliberate step forward. She looked at Mary. Then she lowered her head in the slow, composed acknowledgement of a woman who knows what she is doing and means to do it in front of everyone present. Lady Cecilia Morrow's mother rose. Her daughter followed without spectacle. The movement spread across the table. The General's sister, the Lord Lieutenant's wife, the 2 members of Parliament who exchanged the rapid glance of men who intend to be elsewhere before anyone asks them to take a position. In under 4 minutes the room held the Duke, Mary, the Dowager, Agnes at the sideboard, and Mr. Pemberton at the door. The Dowager looked at the emptied chairs, at the certificate in the candlelight, at her son, and at Mary, and something in her face understood, fully and finally, the shape of what had happened. "You have thrown away everything," she said. Her voice had changed, not smaller. The Dowager was not capable of smaller, but stripped of its performance. What remained was something older and simpler, and not entirely without pain. "Everything this family stands for a girl who stood in my dining room for 3 months," the Duke said, "while you were cruel to her and did not leave." He turned from his mother. He walked the length of the table to where Mary stood. He offered her his arm. She looked at him. The wine was drying cold against her skin. Behind her she could hear the Dowager draw breath for another word, and she did not look back. She took his arm. They walked out of the dining room together. Behind them she heard Agnes's silence, comprehensive, deliberate, final, in response to whatever the Dowager said. In the entrance hall, the Duke stopped. The footman who had been stationed by the door found something urgent to attend to elsewhere, with the discretion of a man who has been in service long enough to know when his presence is not required. They were alone. The house was quiet in the way that large houses go quiet when something that was building for a long time has finally finished. Mary could hear the distant sound of chairs being moved in the dining room, Mrs. Pemberton directing the aftermath with her customary efficiency. She could feel the cold from the wine still against her skin, the silk heavy and dark across her bodice where it had been cream. She had been waiting for this. Not this specific entrance hall or this specific evening, but the end of the waiting itself, which she had known was coming since November, and which had taken 3 months longer than it should have, and which had cost her things she was only now, standing here, beginning to account for. "I should have done that the day you arrived," he said. "Yes," she said. It was not a rebuke. It was the truth as she understood it, which is a different thing. "I'm sorry," he said. "For what 3 months cost you, for getting it wrong, for believing a plan could account for what a determined person is capable of when she has made a decision about someone she considers beneath her notice." He paused. "I underestimated my mother, and it was you who paid for it." Mary looked at him. The candles in the hall were lit, and the evening was resolving, slowly, from something she had been braced for into something she was only now beginning to feel. "Agnes brought me covered plates," she said, "on Tuesdays and Thursdays when the cupboard was locked. For 3 months, without being asked, without mentioning it directly. She simply left the plate and walked away." She paused. "Your household is full of people who knew what was right. They were waiting for someone to say it out loud." He was quiet for a moment. "I know," he said. "I should have been the one to say it sooner." She looked at him in the candlelit hall, this man she had married in Vienna in November, and spent 3 months waiting for, who had gotten it badly wrong and knew it, and was not trying to make it smaller than it was. "Yes," she said for the 3rd time, "you should have." Then, because she had been holding composure for 3 months and he was here now, and the reason for holding it was finished. "But you said it." Later that evening, when the house had settled into the particular silence that follows an event of consequence, Mary was in the Duchess's suite, which had been kept locked for 3 years and still smelled faintly of the woman who had occupied it before her, sitting on the edge of the bed in the ruined dress because she had not yet made herself move, because the evening was still working its way from recent fact into something she could hold. She heard him knock. She said, "Come in." He came in and closed the door and sat in the chair across from her, and neither of them spoke for a moment. Then he said, "I was afraid." She waited. "Not only of my mother," he said, "of repeating what I had already done. Anne died alone because I was in Lisbon, being indispensable to the crown, and absent to everything that mattered. I could not see how to bring you in, publicly, formally, with the announcement and the social presentation, without putting you at the centre of exactly the kind of pressure and scrutiny that I had watched destroy a woman before." He looked at his hands, then back at her. "I told myself I was being careful. I put you in a house with my mother, with no standing, with no one who knew what you were, and I called it protection and told myself the arrangement was temporary." He paused. "It was not protection. It was me being afraid of the wrong things, and not looking clearly at what I was actually doing to you." Mary said, "She locked my food cupboard." He closed his eyes briefly. "She docked my wages for being in the morning room before she had finished her correspondence." "I know." "Agnes brought me food at night, for 3 months, without being asked." He said, "I will see Agnes is properly recognised." "I told her earlier today that she has the position of lady's maid," Mary said. "If that is acceptable to you." He looked at her. The same small recalibration she had seen twice before, in Vienna and in the schoolroom, the expression of a man encountering something consistently better than what he had prepared himself to receive. He said, "I would marry you again." "In Vienna," she said. "Anywhere," he said, in front of every peer in England if you required it, in front of this county, this household, anyone you named. She thought of 20 empty chairs, of the Lord Lieutenant's wife's expression of rapid recalculation, of Lady Cecilia Morrow looking quietly at her plate with the relief of a woman who has been released from an obligation she did not want. She said, "I do not require an audience." "No," he said, "you never did." He crossed the room. He took her hand between both of his and held it without ceremony, which was his way of doing everything that mattered to him. She did not pull her hand back. They sat there in the Duchess's suite in the quiet of a house that was hers now, while the candle on the mantelpiece burned itself down, and neither of them spoke, because there was nothing left that needed saying that evening. 6 months later, the Dower House lights were extinguished by 9 o'clock every evening, and the Dowager Eleanor Carew received no dinner invitations that autumn from any family of standing in the county. Agnes had settled into her new position with the satisfaction of a woman who had been certain how things would end long before they ended that way, and who found the satisfaction of being correct a sufficient reward for everything the intervening period had cost her. Thomas was working through Cicero in the original Latin. The twins had named a kitten after the Duke, which he affected not to know about, and which made the twins extremely happy. By the following spring, the Duchess of Stanthorpe was expecting her first child. She told the Duke on a Tuesday morning in the library, in the composed voice she had maintained through 3 months of a locked cupboard and a cold room and a ruined dress, and she watched his face. He went very still. Then he sat down in the nearest chair and covered his face with both hands, and she understood that his composure, the formal distance he had worn for 15 years as the only armour that had proven reliable, had finally, completely run out. She came and sat beside him. She put her hand over his. Outside, the children were shouting in the garden over some dispute about the kitten that had reached a volume requiring adult intervention. Inside, for the first time since November the 12th, something that had been waiting a long time to be finished was simply done. One door remained open. The young solicitor who had confirmed the marriage's legal standing was still in correspondence with the Duke's youngest ward, whose education was not yet settled and whose future remained entirely her own business. Whether she intended to make it his business too was a question the spring had not yet answered. But spring had a way of answering questions that winter leaves open. Mary Linwood had arrived at Stanthorpe Hall in November with a single trunk and a marriage certificate she had not been permitted to use. She had spent 3 months being invisible. She spent the rest of her life being anything but.